Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Information Revolution. It's a podcast about information for people working with information, thinking about how things are now and how things need to change. I'm Michael Upton. I'm a director of Metataxis New Zealand, a little consultancy based in Wellington, and I spend my days thinking about digital information.
And I'm Judi Vernau, also with Metataxis New Zealand in Wellington. I'm an information architect and spend my days thinking about how to structure information and describe it.
And I'm Karl Melrose. I work for Castlepoint Systems in Canberra. My views are my own. But other places you can find me. I'm on the Rimper Branch Council for South Australia until they change that structure in 2 weeks' time. You can find my blog at metairm.substack.com. And honestly, I'm just always really pleased to hang out with you two. So, Michael, what are we talking about today?
Thanks very much, Carl. Today we're going to talk about engaging with your executive. So it seemed like a logical follow-on. We're still talking about the people stuff. Last
Yeah.
episode, very happy to have Gillian Oliver on talking about information cultures. And we talked a little bit there about uh, levels of engagement and where you want to reach. The idea that there's kind of different sort of cultures occurring within any particular organization, and that one size doesn't fit all in terms of your approach to improving information culture. So one aspect was definitely about the exec and about knowing what it is you're going to do when you're talking to them, and basically what they're good for and what they're not.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting last week to think about those subcultures across the organization. So it was clear that if we say organizational culture, that isn't necessarily a thing, it's lots of individual things within an overriding culture, as it were. But yeah, so we said, what does that mean for approaching management? And I guess then the management is going to be, as it were, a subculture, if I can say it like that. Like, what is going to tick their boxes? How do they think about things? It was interesting when Gillian said, "Oh, even the way you present the information, like they want to see spreadsheets, or they want to see bullet pointed PowerPoints, or they want you to just talk to them, or whatever it is. You need to think about even the method of presentation of what you're trying to say, let alone the content."
The genres. That's how she
So I
was
thought
defining that.
that was a good point. Yeah,
Sorry, I was just
any
saying
more
that's what Gillian described as genres. So understanding the genre
genres?
that you needed to be operating
Yes,
within to maximize what you were getting out of your exec.
yeah, that's right.
Hmm. So I think for me, another aspect of what she mentioned in passing is that idea of understanding what it is your exec is good for and what it is you're going to get from them. Because we actually discussed, and we've brought it up a few times, the idea that if you're trying to engage in an actual cultural shift in an organization, you're trying to change the way that um, people work with information, then really that's probably going to happen at an operational level. Yeah, it's not necessarily actually up at the exec level where um, people are really familiar with this idea that actually the people working on the exec don't have time to be faffing around in kind of records and information systems and so forth. So they actually typically don't have current first-hand experience of a lot of the kinds of things that you might be trying to shift within an organization and within an
Yes.
organization's practices. So working with the exec, um, the massive benefit I would see in terms of working with the exec is just getting mandate, like getting a clear authority to do something
Mm.
within an organization and say, look, yes, this is what we're trying to achieve. And so I think conversations there, I was thinking about this before coming on here. I used to work with a very commercially minded sales guy who used to just push me whenever I was talking about the idea of providing information related services. He would push me to say, is this going to increase revenue? Is it going to reduce costs to do something? Or is it going to stop me showing up on the front page of the paper? And he was like, if you can't say one of those three things is true, then um, how are you of interest to the executive? Like, and I think this is really valuable. Uh, there's been a bit of a kind of swing back and forth, a kind of pendulum between sort of different, well, not even a pendulum, but there's multiple different ways you can think about what records and information is all about. But um, if, for instance, we think it's about, managing entitlements and making sure that people can kind of um, be treated fairly by the government and seek justice and all those kinds of things that like I'm totally all about that. Like I totally believe in that stuff, but that's not going to win me over with the exec. Like if I go to the exec and start banging on about how like what about the downtrodden, they're going to go, whatever.
Yeah, I've got stuff to do.
Yeah, I've got enough
And
to do.
yeah, so I think the thing that we have to remember is that, we are selling to the executive. If you can make a decision, you make the decision. If you can't make the decision, you have to sell it to someone. And, that issue that Michael touched on earlier of, what's executive worthy? Is this going to increase revenue, reduce costs, or stop me showing up on the front page of the paper? Is it going to do those things to a degree that, um, is worthy of executive time? Because these are the people who are trying to make the big strategic decisions of the organization. I wrote a blog post a little while ago talking about this because I think that the most important person, or in the organisation for a records team, is actually the middle. They're the middle managers above the records function. If you're lower down in the organisation,
Yeah.
because those are the people who they see across the organisation. They can convince other middle managers who really they have a lot of budget driving power, and they're the ones that if the executive are going to listen to someone and take them seriously and say, yes, I'm going to fund that, it's going to be on the back of a middle manager coming to them and saying, hey, we've got this opportunity over here and we should fund it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and, I think there's that issue too of you can only sell from a place of credibility. And, one of the ongoing conversations that I have with people in the organizations that I work with, because fundamentally I sell things for a living, particularly when we go to trade shows, is I'll take somebody along who's, technical in nature, or who's a records management consultant or something like that, and we'll have a conversation about how they're not sales before we go to the conference. And it's like I was saying, if you can make a decision, you make a decision. If you can't, you've got to sell it to someone who can make it. We're all selling a lot of the time. The only difference really is you can either sell badly or you can sell well. And, if you're making a decision that you're not sales and that therefore you shouldn't be selling anything, well, if that means that you don't want to persuade people to get things done, um, which is, just more selling, that's okay. But you've got to find someone who's comfortable doing that and who you feel can adequately represent you. And I don't know about you, but I always want to be in control of that conversation. But on the selling front, one of the biggest challenges for records is that you can only sell effectively from a place of credibility. And I think that's the first thing that everybody in records needs to think about before they actually go to their executive and say, and actually try and sell something. Because a lot of executives have come up through government over the last 20 years, and what they've actually got is they've got a legacy of people in records being the people who say to them, no, you can't implement that business system because it doesn't comply with whatever regulations. No, you can't do that. This is illegal. Et cetera, et cetera. And they've gone on and done all these things anyway, and there haven't been any problems. And so records management don't necessarily have a lot of credibility from having said no. The other thing that a lot of records teams haven't done is they haven't embraced digital technologies, and they're still trying to get people to put a document into a record system. And, if you are going to an executive and you're trying to convince an executive that, you can effectively implement something, and the executive knows that the capture rate in your organization is somewhere between 5 and 10%, very low. So the actual implementation of the records policy is not particularly effective. then you might have a bit of trouble going to them and saying, I need $5 million to do, to buy this new record system, or, I need a significant amount of money and I need the organization to fundamentally change the way it manages information. You might find that that's a really big ask, which, it isn't it's not it just turns it into a long-term problem. And one of the nice things about records management, one of the things that I really like, is that if you look at the tenure of most people in records and you look at the tenure of most executives even in government agencies, CIO tenures are down to, somewhere between 12 months and 2 years. And,
Hmm.
every time I go and talk to a records team, you know, if you've been there for 5 years, then you're Johnny come lately, or Janet come lately. Is probably more appropriate. So, the nice thing about that is that, records teams can kind of, I think most records teams are going to outlast the tenure of most executives. So you can actually go through that process of building credibility.
Uh,
But the process of building credibility so that you can engage with your executive isn't, I'm going to elevator pitch my executive every time I see them.
yeah,
It's, I'm going to provide a basis for reference selling. And reference selling is really, that's that process where, you know, every time you go to the executive to ask for something, there's three middle managers who will come along and say, yeah, the records team came to me and said, we can do a small project over
yeah.
here to improve performance. And they delivered on it. And it was
I
great.
was,
It did everything they said.
yeah, I was gonna say something exactly along those lines, actually, from what I was thinking about before. I mean, you need to identify those key stakeholders who have got the influence, who can, just what you said there, Carl, come along with you, or bend the exec's ear, because you, in your position, may not actually have the authority. They're going to go, oh, not interested, whatever. Um, but if you can persuade the people who do have the ear, then that's probably the way to go, or a good way to
Yeah.
go. But also, exactly what you said there, Carl, about having good projects to showcase what you can do. I think that's a really good way to get the ear as well. If you've got some if you can identify some projects that really will showcase the possibilities that give a success story, then
Yeah.
that's really good.
A great example, and here's a little tip as well. We are narrative beings. We have this whole part of our brain that actually just constantly assembles coherent narratives about the world. And so a lot of sales and selling well, particularly to executives, is all about storytelling. Credibility is just a story. Talking about credibility here is just a story about how, you know, Mr. or Mrs. Executive, if you give me some money and your authority, I will make good use of it and I will make you look good. That's what credibility is. It's a story about that. But, a little story that, I think is really relevant. I have a friend of mine who's at a department here in South Australia, and an information manager came into their, this organization has a long history of underinvesting in information management because the executives just actually don't believe in it. They don't believe it can produce results, and they just don't believe in it, even though there is ample evidence to the contrary. But, they had an information manager come in, put a business
Mm,
case together, ask for, and it was actually $5 million for a new record system, and they were going to do all these things and modernize everything. But information management didn't have the credibility in the organization. The executive didn't believe in it. So, not surprisingly, it didn't get up. The next information manager that came in, who's this friend of mine, um, they were expecting the $5 million ask. She found a problem in a problem in the chief executive's office to do with some form of correspondence, and said, right, we're going to focus on that. I need $10,000 to fix it. And we're just going to use the existing systems. And, it was an old record system that, was really quite creaky. But she looked at it and she said, for about $10,000, I think we can solve this problem. And she got the $10,000. She solved the problem. And, this is the virtuous cycle of building that power and influence and credibility.
yeah,
That's a story that she can now go to every other person in the organization and say, hey, in the chief executive's office, I fixed this problem. And she's going to have people in the chief executive's office now saying, yeah, no, you can believe them. They worked with us on this problem and they solved it, and life got better. They increased revenue, reduced costs, and stopped us showing up on the front page of the paper. And I think that's the kind of project that really gets missed a lot. Everybody tends to focus on the really big, sexy projects, digital transformation, everything else. But I really think credibility within an organization is built on the little things. It's the virtuous cycle that helping a team organize and manage their work so that they can be more effective. I think it's all of those little stories.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. I think that there's kind of a flavour in what we've been talking about over the last few episodes with thinking about sort of focus on people and change in people is that
Mm,
it's incremental, it's small. And that's not quite on the track of talking about how you deal with the exec, but it is how you establish credibility, and it is how you make real change occur over time. It's it's almost piecemeal. Like ideally, you want a direction and a strategy in your head, but you're doing small things at a time to basically make it clear that, you know, when I tried to do the small thing, it worked, and I can build on that small thing, and maybe next time it's going to be a medium-sized thing, if you're
Look,
lucky.
but I mean, it's that topic we were talking about before, where building up to that layer of middle management, and getting them to really endorse you.
mm,
Well, I mean, if you've got 50 middle managers in your organization who have all got their own mini organization underneath them, and you want to make change that affects those 50, middle managers, then, if they don't believe that it's actually going to work, you're just going to end up with a turf war, which is going to be ugly for everybody. But, if you can go through that process of, picking a really influential middle manager and saying, right, we're going to focus on their business unit, partly because they're influential, but partly because they've got problems to solve. And we're going to work with them on solving their problems over a longer period of time. It might take you 2 years. Then you can build yourself into a position where all of a sudden you can engage with the executive and they'll take you seriously because you've got someone saying, these people have got 2 years of, absolutely delivering with credibility on everything they said they would. And it's been great working with them. And, if we did that through the rest of the organization, it's about building a platform so that you
mm.
can actually talk to your executive credibly.
Yeah, I wondered, Judy, so thinking about when you talk to the exec and what you're actually trying to get from that, I wondered, Judy, if you think sort of in the context of information architecture, is that an exec conversation in your mind? Do you need to have the conversation with the exec there?
Not Probably not, because they're not going to understand or care
Yeah,
about what you're talking about. Of
it's a bit of
course,
a
except
loaded
when they,
question, but that's kind of what I was thinking too. Sorry, keep
but
going.
it's true. And I mean, the business case for example, Microsoft 365, they're not going to be thinking in terms of, oh yeah, that's a big spend on information architecture. They're going to be thinking just about what's the cost of the technology itself. Um, so really, it's making the case for, but you can't put this in without an information architecture. It's more of a piece of the puzzle,
Mm.
which is possibly easier to sell, but not always. On the other hand, it's actually relatively easy to come up with examples of places that haven't introduced an information architecture in that situation and
Yeah.
have failed.
But
I mean,
this
I
is
can
the how you reduce risk side of the conversation.
exactly. I mean, I
Mm.
can I can pull out several examples with no problem at all about people who've done that without an IA, and lo and behold, it doesn't work.
This is the conversation everyone should have had about Microsoft 365, right? There should have been someone going to the executive at some point and saying, hey, the pandemic's just hit and we need to shift everybody over to working from home. We've got this Microsoft 365 thing we can buy here, and it's got Teams, and that will allow us to do all of the collaborative working that we need to do. And here's how much it costs. And then hopefully there should have been a discussion about, well, what about all the information and security risks that poses? And great, here's how we're going to mitigate those. And, the mitigation strategies would have been, we're going to have a mature information architecture. We're going to do a security risk assessment. It's the other side of the things, because it's the it's the risk assessment that stops you ending up on the front page of the paper when you sign off on a perfectly good project.
That's true. And I mean, a huge risk for me is just that you implement something and you might as well not have bothered, because what you end up with is just like a slightly more modern version of shared files, because stuff is everywhere. Nobody knows where to find it. You can't get from here to there very easily. So it's just yet another mess.
And now it's $75 per user per month.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah, 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 yeah,
exactly.
So it's an expensive mess.
yeah. Yeah, and I think
Exactly.
but and Carl, in describing how you might kind of describe that shift into 365 to the exec, you just sort of mentioned information architecture as a kind of a line item, and I feel like that's the level, right? And I think a lot of what we're doing in working with information is actually often from the exec's perspective, it's just at that level. Like, so our priority needs to be on building those relationships at a more operational level where people care basically about the detail of, like, you know,
Yeah.
Yeah.
oh, okay, this actually means that, I need a smooth process for this team from start to finish, and we need to know
Mm,
where the information comes from and where it goes and how fast we
yeah.
need to access it and all those things we've talked about in the past.
Yeah.
Whereas the
Yeah.
exec just needs to know, hey, there's an issue to tackle here, and a credible person is telling you that you need to tackle it, and it's going to cost about this much. That's how I feel.
It's going to be successful.
Mm.
And
Yes, and
the point you made is perfect. I mean, if I'm when I try to take a new application into an organization, one of the people who, the CIO might be the person who says yes in the end, but they're going to go through 14 other little bits of diligence before they do that. And one of the other things they're going to go through is, well, we have an enterprise architect here. How does this product fit into our enterprise architecture? But they're not going to have that conversation with me. They're going to have their director of architecture have that conversation. And, they're probably going to have some BAs who are actually going to have different bits of that conversation as well. And then there's going to be a security team that will probably have that conversation. And this is actually one of the things that makes executive engagement on projects really hard. It's that inevitably you aren't just going to one person and saying and getting them to sign it off. You've got to go through this process of, there are 14 different people who need to say yes to this thing you want to do, and we've got to get a yes from all of them, or it doesn't happen. Which probably makes a bit of a mockery of the idea that we just go to a senior executive and they say yes.
they've got many things they're trying to do at a sort of certain level that is not
Mm.
necessarily the same level that we're necessarily working at. And I think that's fine. And I think I mean, sometimes it's kind of humbling, but it's not like, oh my gosh, I'm, things are failing somehow if I'm not going and getting the ear of the exec, because it's like, well, I think you need to be very, very clear on when that's
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah. Yep. No, I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think we do talk about needing to persuade the executive all the time. But exactly what you've just said, is that actually what we need to be doing? Or
I mean,
should we be focusing on that other level?
Yeah, I feel like the key
if you
thing
want
that we're repeating here is about, when you need money, when you need funding, you need and
Who's got the money?
and I said
Yeah.
at the start about a mandate, it's kind of part and parcel, right? If they're meaningfully giving you a mandate, then there's dollars.
and
Otherwise they
it's
haven't really given you the mandate.
Mm.
scope of change as well. I mean,
Right.
if you want to roll out a new records management policy, I mean, you need an executive to sign it, because they're
Hmm.
the only people who've got authority over the whole organisation. Um,
Sure.
and another quick point as well: my absolute manual for executive engagement is a book called The Real Business of IT. It's written by a bunch of Gartner consultants.
Mm.
They've got a really simple process in there that, I know a couple of people that I've I've given a lot of copies of this book away over the years. And honestly, you can do a find and replace on IT and records in this book, and it reads perfectly for all of the challenges that we have in records. But I actually, I bought. There's a company called Thrift Books that they sell secondhand books. That they had, I think they had 38 copies of this book. I bought them all so that I could give them to people a couple of years ago. I still have about 6 or 8 copies left. If somebody wants to send me an email,
Nice.
I will happily pass it out. But it's a really simple process. Part one, avoid value traps. Change your thinking. And the value trap, Judi, you described one of them perfectly. If you go to a chief executive and start talking to them about information architecture, they're not going to want to keep having the conversation.
No.
They're going to want to stop that really quickly. They're going to wonder why you aren't talking to the person 14 levels down in the organization who, actually looks after that. Step 2 is show that you provide value for money, which basically means that you've got to be able to benchmark your service so you can go to your chief executive who is inevitably trying to find places where they're spending too much money and say, we're good value because we've benchmarked ourselves. And, it's like lots of people are doing this with inbound mail handling at the moment. Everybody's been trying to outsource it, but I know 14 departments that have actually benchmarked how much it's costing them to deliver the service internally. And they've kept the service inside, or they've brought it back inside because they know they can deliver on it cheaply and more effectively. But show that you provide value for money. And there's a lot of things you've got to do in that. You've got to have you've got to have your service catalog sorted and some other things. Once you've done that, you can actually go on to show that you actually improve business performance. But people won't trust you to improve business performance until they think you're good value. And then once you've shown that you can improve business performance, then you can actually start having a strategic conversation. But the thing that the book makes clear is that, and it studies CIOs from the early 2000s, when CIOs were seen as the people who said no all the time. And the software industry actually invented SaaS so they could sell to line of business executives. And line of business executives loved it because it meant they didn't have to deal with IT, which, if you think about what's going on with records in a lot of organizations at the moment, that's actually what's going on with records in a lot of organizations at the moment. And the thing that was really clear to these guys is that every time someone tried to skip a step, it failed. So, they've got a really nice, clear process. And a couple of the people that I've passed this book out to in information management have been working this process in their organization and actually starting to have some really good results, with the executives starting to really listen and see them as credible. So
Fantastic.
I'll post a link to it in the show notes.
Yeah,
Yeah, good
perfect.
idea.
Brilliant. So I reckon we should probably wrap today's one up there. So yeah, some really useful ideas I think there around sales and the reality that is, part of our jobs and part of what we do, whether or not you want to describe it in those terms. Yeah, I just want to reinforce what Karl mentioned about the idea of storytelling as well. Like that's something that someone taught to me back in the day. I should tell the story of storytelling, but it's really effective. It really works. So yeah. So thanks everyone for listening in. And if you've got any questions or if you want to get a book from Karl, then get in touch.
Limited copies, but yes, I do still have some.
So, all right. Thanks all. See ya.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.